Hello everyone, welcome to Zoonosis with Joy. I'm Joy, and today we're going to be learning about animals and gender. Happy Pride Month, everyone. I want to talk a little bit about what gender is, how we gender animals, and how animals may or may not gender themselves. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Even if the YouTube algorithm will crucify me for it, I'm going to make it anyway because it is Pride Month, and I've been wanting to make this video for a very long time. So let's get to it. But first I want to ask you, has this ever happened to you? Oh my gosh, is that a bunny? Oh my gosh, can I pet your bunny? Okay. Yeah, I guess you can. Oh my gosh, it's so soft. What's his name? His name? Did I hear you correctly? Her name is Bun Bun. And the next time you make that mistake, it will be your last. I didn't mean it like that. You're not mad at me, are you? I know where you live. I'm going to find you. I'm going to hunt you down like a dog. You will never see the sun again. Everyone will wonder what happened to you, what mistake you did. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. And the mistake you made was misgendering Bun Bun. She is a little lady, and you need to get it right. Because if you don't get it right, you don't have to go through me. Understand? Okay, Oh, it has happened to you. Oh, so it's not just me who gets yelled at by people for misgendering their animals. Well, so let's think about this. Why do people get so offended if you say the wrong pronouns or misgender an animal when that animal may or may not care about how humans socially interact with each other on the basis of sex? Well, why does this matter to people? And why is it considered rude if you misgender them? Well, I think understanding that may get to the understanding of a lot of human problems, actually, and understanding a lot more about animals and how animals relate to the world. And the disconnect between the two can be very interesting. And I think that's kind of what I wanted to explore in this video. Do animals have gender? Do animals gender themselves? Do animals have gender with relation to human beings? And what does that even mean? And what are we talking about, right? So the gender anarchists among you and people who are rad and cool and good and based already know all about this. So maybe, I don't know, go do something, go outside and read a book or have friends, that kind of thing. The rest of you should be strapped in a dungeon and forced to watch this video until you get the message. But let's think about this for a few minutes about the difference between sex and gender. And it might be a little bit elementary, but it's important that we set the stage here a little bit. The difference was articulated back in the 60s and 70s, partly as a reaction to second-wave feminism, which started to articulate the ways that gender was interacting with people of the female sex, and also the way that it interacts with the people of the male sex. Because we don't just talk about male and female, we talk about men and women, and the differences between them can be a little bit interesting. So I think that it is something that's worth investigating here as we talk about animals. Now, what is sex? Sex is what I have with your mom, and gender, I hardly know her, but more on that later, perhaps. So sex is a collection of biological characteristics which can help determine the reproductive strategy of an individual. And that often includes the primary sexual characteristics, i.e. the genitals, the secondary sexual characteristics. In humans, we think beards and boobs, but in other animals, it is things like bright plumage and big claws and all this kind of cool stuff, right? It's groovy. This is the Charles Darwin, sexual selection, oh yeah. So that kind of interesting stuff, the stuff that makes it on Animal Planet. You know what I'm saying? That kind of stuff, right? There's also we think about the chromosomes a little bit, and maybe the chromosome thing's a bit of a hang-up because mammals, they have XY, that's male, they have XX, which is female, but birds have ZZ, which is male, and ZW, which is female. Bees, ants, and wasps, those kind of hymenoptera insects, they have haplodiploidy. So males only have one copy of the genetics, and females have two copies. So what's going on there? And some animals, the genetics don't really matter at all. It's about environment and what the environment kind of helps determine the sex during development. So this is something like alligators, right? So alligators, when they make a nest, the eggs that are on the cooler side tend to be more female, and the ones that are on the warmer side are more likely to be male. So there's tight temperature kind of regulation here that determines the sex in these individuals. There's also hormonal aspects to this too, right? So the secondary sexual characteristics are often related to the levels of androgens or progesterones or estrogens, and those can often be grouped into male or female categories. And we also see that the gametes are often what most biologists use to classify male and female in a species, right? And that might not be strictly homologous, but between different branches, right? But for our purposes, that's usually what's classified as male and female in most species, right? So the larger gametes, which are ova, are produced by females, and the smaller gametes or spermatozoa or sperm cells are produced primarily by males. But that's not always true. That's in dioecious species like ours, where there are separate male and female sexes. In the monoecious organisms, that means one house, they often are in the same individuals. Most plants are like this, but also, things like earthworms and slugs and that kind of thing, they can be monoecious organisms too. We also see that some animals are sequentially monoecious. So when we think about clownfish, for instance, they often begin their lives as males producing sperm. They get older, they get larger, and they start producing ova like females. Good for them. So sex can be kind of an interesting thing. And even though we have these standard kind of characteristics, these characteristics not always are mapping evenly or separately on every single individual, and there can be some ambiguity. So in humans, we often say that individuals with a mixture of both, they often are called intersex. And now how many of them there are is quite debatable. I'd say it's anywhere between 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 50, depending on the category or the rubric of intersex, right? So intersex people are pretty common in our society, or they may be rare depending kind of how we define it, right? And the problem of definition is quite important for most intersex people because it's often the courts or medical doctors who decide for them what sex they are. And this is a huge problem because this can determine their reproductive lives, their sex lives, their legal standing, that kind of thing. And so these individuals have what's called the state of exception, that doctors can just go and decide their lives in the space of ambiguity where the law doesn't really give you much direction otherwise. Correct me, political theology nerds in the chat, if I'm wrong below. But that all being aside, that's kind of sex in a nutshell. That would be very uncomfortable. But let's talk a little bit about gender. Gender is often more of a cultural or social sort of phenomenon. And individuals often understand their gender at a young age, in human beings at least. We don't know about animals, we'll get to that in a second. But in humans, gender is often the social and cultural aspects which are manifest in the lives of people based on their sex, usually. And this is often culturally sort of relegated. For example, in our own society, women wear dresses, men wear suits, women wear makeup, and men shout at Fox News at 3 a.m. in their underpants about the George Soros elites or something. I don't know. There seems to be some weird codings, and this isn't culturally universal because in some societies, it would be very weird for women to let their hair out in public, and in other societies it's expected. And if women aren't having their hair down low, they're questioned as some sort of non-women, right? So there's ways that this can be very different and very weird, and I think that's worth investigating, especially when we start looking outside of humanity and we start looking to other beings in our social sphere, because humans aren't the only living organisms in our social lives. We have our animals as well. So that's what I want to talk about next. How are animals gendered, and what does that tell us about human gender? Or gender in general? Gender in general. Okay, so for historical reasons, you can buy an animal and own it. This might seem like a pretty basic thing, right? And you go down to the dog store and you get yourself a dog, and you take your dog around town, that kind of thing. But the privilege that we grant individuals for owning an animal is that they can name their animal whatever they want. And sometimes this is a really bad idea because people have really deranged ideas of what is appropriate to name their animals. So for example, sometimes people do name their animals inappropriate words or slurs, and that can be very alienating if you have to call out that name in public, and people will start looking at you. But people do this, right? This is I'm not like spitballing here. Like, I've seen many cases of people calling their animals just bizarre things. You could call your animal a number. You can call your animal an alphanumeric string of characters that individually correspond to them that no other animal in the world has. So why do we have names? Well, until recently, scientists never assigned names to subject animals in tests or wild animals in observational kind of studies. It wasn't until Jane Goodall that we actually started doing this. And her argument was pretty actually sound in terms of that. It was that, well, chimpanzees, they're individuals. They're not kind of different based on all, they're not like mutually exchangeable. They all have their own personalities. They all have their own lives. They all are very different from one another. So it makes sense to name them individually. But this made a lot of scientists very angry because aren't you just anthropomorphizing them? Aren't you just saying that they're like humans and that we could project our human values onto them? And I think this is a valid point, or at least we should take this seriously. Now, until very recently, if you were said an animal's name on TV, or if you were publishing in a newspaper, they would often put quotation marks around an animal's name because it was presumed that animals don't have names. They have nicknames. They have things that monikers or things that people call them as like a friendly anthropomorphic jape. Well, what is anthropomorphism? Well, anthropomorphism is assigning human qualities to non-human animals or things, right? And apparently this is very common for autistic people, so neurospicy people out there, leave a like in the chat. But if you think about it, this makes a lot of sense. They often have trouble relating to other people, but they may relate better to inanimate objects. And this doesn't seem that crazy to us. I mean, we often name boats things. We often name cities have names. We don't need to give cities names, but we do give them that. We give countries names. We give lots of things names that are proper nouns, right? And they don't need those things. It's not going to make them feel any better. But we also give animals names, and so that's kind of cool. But we don't just give animals names, we also give them pronouns. Now, I saw this really cool article last year, and I think about it probably once a week or so. It was about Godzilla, and if you know me from my previous videos, I've worn Godzilla shirts. I'm a huge Godzilla fan, as it turns out, because I am an obsessive nerd. And in the original Japanese Toho Godzilla movies, and the kaiju are always referred to with the pronouns it, its. Now, in the Americanizations, though, they're often given gendered pronouns. Godzilla is he, him in those adaptations instead of the it's, its. That would sound wrong. Godzilla, it is destroying the city versus Godzilla, he is destroying the city. It just doesn't sound right in English, so they assigned him a gender, and he's now he, him in those adaptations. The only Toho monster with an actual pronouns that aren't it, its is actually Mothra. Mothra is she, her, because she is a total queen. Anyway, getting back to animal pronouns, one of the cool things too, and they don't tell you this, no one tells you this, is you can call your animal whatever pronouns you want to. It doesn't matter what sex they are. No one's gonna stop you, right? I have a friend who has a cat that is a male cat that my friend calls she, her, and uses she, her pronouns and has a feminine name. And you know what? No one can stop you from doing that. The animal won't care. You're not going to traumatize it and get it bullied or whatever for misgendering it. Where it really matters is when you start doing paperwork. And this is not just bureaucratic pencil pushing nonsense, but this can be very important if you go to a dog show, or if you go to the veterinary clinic, or if you're trying to register your animal. They want to know what the gender of your animal is. And I say gender very specifically here because it's not just the sex of the animal that we're worried about, it's also the role that the animal has that can be determined in many ways. You're thinking to yourself, wait, hang on. My dog is not gendered, my dog is male, he's a boy dog, right? Well, I invite you to re-examine this hypothesis. If you go to a veterinary clinic and you see veterinary records, We have 4 genders for dogs, cats, and rabbits. There is male intact, female intact, male neutered, and female spayed. What does that mean? Well, it means that we have created new genders for animals depending on their role. And you think to yourself, well, hang on, this is just modern, SJW nonsense. But this goes all the way back, baby, all the way back to the origins of Western civilization. Horses, for you horse people out there, have 3 primary genders. And this goes all the way back to the roots of Indo-European language. There are stallions, which are male intact horses. There are mares, which are females. And we also have geldings, which are castrated males. The difference is not simply anatomical, it's also the social roles that these animals play. So from ancient times, stallions were often ridden as war animals, and they were used as stud animals. Mares, of course, were used for breeding, and they raised new foals, but they could be used for many different roles in that society. But geldings were different. Geldings were almost always used as pack animals or for draft. They weren't used for war because they were often less aggressive, they often were smaller, and they often were friendlier. So they weren't, and less strong in some senses. So there often was this kind of gender distinction. Now, of course, if you meet a gelding, you'd probably say, he's over there, right? You'd probably say he, him. That doesn't mean that it's not a separate gender. In fact, if you see it on a form for registering a horse, they'd have, stallion, mare, or gelding, right? So there seems to be a way that we're gendering animals differently than we are humans. This gets even more confusing if you look at production animals. So, for example, cattle. Cattle also have 4 genders, but they're different than that of dogs and cats. There are bulls, which are intact males. There's also steers, which are castrated males. So far so good. This is very similar to horses. But then, if you think about it, there's also cows, which are females that have had multiple kind of births. And then there's heifers. Heifers are females which have yet to calve. And so this distinction matters because heifers are more likely to go into dystocia and have problems giving birth. They may produce less milk on their first kind of parturition, and they often are younger than the cows, which are older. So the social distinctions that we're laying out here can be very important. All that to say is that the castration aspect is very important because it helps construct genders when it comes to animals in some important ways. Now, castration is a technology that is probably as old as civilization itself. We know that chimpanzees bite each other's parts off in aggressive conflicts, but castration as a technology which reliably produced castrated individuals was something that had to wait till probably the Bronze Age to come around. At least probably till the origins of Indo-European language where we get gelding. So at some point humans figured out how to reliably and reproducibly castrate animals, and they likely applied that to human beings afterwards, although it's hard to know which came first, chicken or egg with that. So it's interesting because in many cultures, eunuchs are considered a different gender from man. And eunuchs played a very distinct social role from men for most of history, right? Eunuchs, they would be people who were living and working inside of harems, in the private living spaces of emperors and powerful men, where other men wouldn't be allowed to go. They were allowed to interact with women in a way that men weren't allowed to. They often were having their own sort of kind of culture that was separate from that of men or women, and they would associate with other eunuchs as well. So there's been some movement to actually reclaim the use of the term eunuch. I'm not sure how to feel about it, but it's one of those things that, if people feel empowered by all means. I mean, I think it's pretty cool as hell. It's pretty based actually to reclaim that because, we often think of eunuchs as people castrated against their will, and there was some of that for sure, yeah. But there was many people who voluntarily castrated themselves, and some did it for identity reasons. So they wanted to be perceived as a eunuch, and they wanted to be in these roles. There's some people also did it for opportunistic reasons. And this seems to be very common. People would castrate themselves so that they could advance their family social position and become, live a more comfortable life. So there's a way that castration is producing genders, not just in humans, but in other animals as well. And so that kind of takes us a little bit into, Well, yeah, animals are part of our social lives, and so we have genders that we expect of them, and that's why people get mad if you misgender their dog. Now, do animals have gender identities that they can reliably think about? Like, do they think, therefore I am female? Or is that something that only humans do? Is that unique to human beings? Well, this is mostly speculative, and I will tell you what I think about it. So in 1995, which is as old as I am, scientists figured out that transgender women have a different part of their brain than cisgender men. That the basal bed nuclei of the stria terminalis was more like that of cisgender women than cisgender men. This was a big discovery in the scientific community because it proved that transgender people weren't just making it up, that they actually were neurologically very similar to that of cisgender women, and that they had the same sort of brains, if you want to put it more bluntly that way. We also know that the intermediate nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus was also gendered in a similar way. And this was discovered when Obama was running for election as president back in 2008. So this has been known for more than 2 decades for most of the stuff, like 3 decades now, that there is a neurological correlates of gender. And that gender isn't simply socially constructed, but it's also in our brains and in our minds. And it's the way that we interact and develop around these sort of constructs can be very different. This is kind of one of those fuzzy subjects, and it can be touchy for some because the way that we culturally sort of ingrain our gender can be very distinct and challenging for us. And I think that I'll kind of defer to Frans de Waal here, who was a primatologist who passed away last year, who talked a little bit about how primates and may or may not have gender. And I want to kind of leave that open here, so I'll let him speak for that.
One of the early advocates of the latter position is the American philosopher Judith Butler, who considers male, quote-unquote, and female, quote-unquote, to be mere constructs. In a seminal 1988 article, she stated, quote, "Because gender is not a fact, the various acts of gender create an idea of gender, and without those acts there would be no gender at all," end quote. Hers is an extreme position with which I can't agree. Nevertheless, I do consider gender a useful concept. Every culture has different norms, habits, and roles for the sexes. Gender refers to the learned overlays that turn a biological female into a woman and a biological male into a man. It's true that we are thoroughly cultural beings. I'd even go further and argue that the concept of gender may suit other primates as well. Apes reach adulthood by about 16 years of age, which gives them ample time to learn from others. If this alters their sex-typical behavior, we should speak of genders in their case as well.
So yeah, that does raise the question here, though, of whether or not animals could have that sort of gender identity. Well, humans, wait for it, are animals. We've known this since the time of Darwin, and before that for sure, that humans are related to all the other animals in the tree of life. Our closest cousins are the great apes. Apes are primates, primates are mammals, mammals are vertebrates, vertebrates are animals. And so that means that animals probably have homologous behaviors that are similar to gender, if not identical in that sort of way, at least a gender identity, or have some sort of neurological sex-specific behavior, if you want to be technical about that. But there's no way of knowing that because we can't ask them. Gender is very language-based, right? And humans are very particular in the ways that they use language, right? I was talking about pronouns, I was talking about names and how specific that can be. So there's a little bit of nuance here. We can't ever ask an animal what gender it is. It's a black box. There's no such thing as a gender mirror test. We can't ever have an animal look at themselves in the mirror and say, I am female, or I am male, or I am neither, right? Or I am both. This is something that only humans, so far as we know, can do. Okay, all that caveat aside, let's talk about animals and gender. So we know that many individual animals are basically acting in ways which are not conforming in terms of their sort of sex-specific behavior. There are many cases where, of course, individuals are, and that seems to be the norm for most species, that they will act in ways that are specific to their sex, right? But in many cases, this isn't always true. And I think probably the most powerful example of this was discussed by Frans de Waal, talking about some of his chimpanzees that he was studying. One of them was named Donna, and Donna was female, but never acted like a stereotypical chimpanzee female. For one thing, Donna never really played like a normal chimpanzee kid, juvenile, basically. So Donna would wrestle wrestle males, basically, and act like a male in those kind of juvenile contexts. And as Donna reached sexual maturity, Donna never actually reproduced, never had any offspring, didn't have normal sort of genital swellings that chimpanzees have. In fact, males were not sexually interested in Donna. Donna would sometimes behave in ways that were more typical of males. So when there was an aggressive confrontation, Donna would get up on hind limbs and have piloerection, so the hair would stand up, and just get really like bold and start hollering and that kind of thing. So that's very unusual for a female chimpanzee, as you could probably imagine. But in some ways, Donna was not like a typical male chimpanzee, in that Donna never really got into any like physical fights. Males typically ignored Donna's sort of aggressive provocations. Frans de Waal says this best, and so I'll give Frans de Waal another kind of interjection here.
Whether we might call Donna trans, quote-unquote, is beyond my ken, because with animals, this is impossible to know. Individuals who are born as one sex yet feel they belong to the opposite sex are known as transgender. Transgender humans actually preferred to turn this description around and prioritize their felt identity. They were born as one sex but found themselves inside the body of the other. We have no way of applying this to Donna, however, because we can't know how she perceived her gender. In many ways, her grooming relations with others, her non-aggressiveness, she acted more like a female than a male. The best way to describe her is perhaps as a largely asexual gender non-conforming individual.
So that being said, we could say that in some cases there's gender nonconformity and asexuality. Sure, we'll grant that. I think there is some ways that animals can have these sort of things.
This is Joy from the editing desk. I forgot to include an anecdote about a gender nonconforming animal of my own household. This refers to my 4-year-old Holland Lop rabbit named Dude. Now, when I adopted Dude from the Humane Society, previous records indicated that his original owners had believed him to be a female and had given him the name Daisy. And of course that name didn't fit him, so we gave him the name Dude after the dude from Big Lebowski. Part of the thing that may have thrown them off is that he has a dewlap, which is a feature that's not typically seen in male rabbits, but is often more present in female rabbits. I believe this is probably part of the breed more than anything, but it's easy to mix that up. It's also the fact that rabbits are hard to sex early on in life, and the misgendering and missexing is very common. But this goes a little bit further, because Dude doesn't always act in ways which are congruous with his sex, right? He often does the humping thing, right? He was castrated relatively late in life, so he still has those kind of behaviors, but he also has some female kind of more specific behaviors. Now, you have to understand the natural ecology of rabbits is to be diggers, so they like to dig in burrows and that kind of thing. And this is so that they can build warrens and kind of protect their young, that kind of thing. Males don't do as much digging. They typically dig little scratches or day beds in the ground so they could sleep in it during the day, and they may forage a little bit by digging, but they typically don't do as much digging as the females. Dude is not like that. Dude loves to dig. It's one of his favorite things to do. He likes to dig in the dig boxes, as I'll show in this video upcoming, but he also likes to scratch at the floor. He likes to dig on the ground. He likes to dig in the carrier. He loves to dig, more so than my female rabbit Darkness, who is a Havana Black. So if you've seen him on Blue Sky, know that he's a bit of a femboy, and we love him very much. Now here's a video of him digging. Thank you for listening for this little aside.
Another case I want to bring up too is the idea that animals may not have a male-female specific sex strategies that are, just one grouping of sex strategy. And these sex strategies can be quite diverse, and so there can be multiple sex strategies for each anatomical sex, basically. So the ways that we talk about these sexual behaviors can be quite interesting too. So if we think about coho salmon, they have an interesting lifestyle. So coho salmon, you may have heard about their migration strategy where they lay eggs in rivers. They will then hatch and they go swim out to the ocean where they get larger and they feed and they grow. And then after a couple years or so, they return up the stream from which they were hatched, and they reproduce and then they die basically. So there is this reproductive sort of strategy that they often have. Now, the ways that they kind of do this can be quite variable. So female coho salmon will lay eggs, and usually they lay eggs in the presence of a male. So the most successful sexual strategy among them is this alpha male strategy. So you have an alpha male who will kind of be bullying and aggressive towards other males and will monopolize the opportunity to fertilize the eggs of the females, to put that in the most delicate way imaginable. It's gross. Fish sex is gross, in my undetached opinion. But the way that they do this is that they bully the other male fish around and they monopolize this opportunity. There will also be satellite males which kind of hang around the periphery and wait for an opportunity that they can try to do the same thing, but they usually are chased off by these aggressive males. Not always, but they usually are kind of opportunistic. There's also a third strategy, and these are called sneak males. I love the sneak males because instead of this like big aggressive alpha strategy, what they do is they're smaller. They can't win in a fight. So they don't even try. They don't do any kind of aggressive sort of behavior. Instead, they quietly wait as the alpha is kind of fighting off competitors and wooing the female. And as the male is trying to fertilize the eggs, the sneak salmon swims in and deposits his own sperm and gets in there too. And apparently the sexual success of these ones is roughly comparable to that of the alphas. This is another stable strategy, basically. It's a sexually selective stable strategy. And so there are multiple different sexual strategies that these male coho salmon can have. So what I want to say about that is that, even if there are two sexes, maybe the genders may not align in other species the way that we think about it, and the way that they're socially interacting in the gender roles that they have may be very different. So we can't always put our human anthropomorphization onto animals and expect them to behave that way. One final kind of thing I want to talk about here is fruit flies. Now, in my previous video about domestication and that kind of thing, I mentioned fruit flies as a modern domesticate, and I want to briefly interject and say, yes, they are indeed domesticated in the sense that they are bred in captivity and they have been altered by captivity in certain ways. I'll leave a link in the description along with the sources that discuss this kind of domestication of fruit flies. But fruit flies have been domesticated primarily for kind of laboratory research. And this laboratory research is quite interesting because it often looks into how genes affect development. And it also affects the development of sex in the species, for sure. So in fruit flies, the sex is determined by a gene called double sex, which I think is hilarious. And if it's activated, the individual becomes male, and if it's not activated, they go on to become female. So there's kind of this binary sex determination. However, that is not sufficient in and of itself to produce sex-specific behavior. That gene is called fruitless. Now, it was originally proposed to be called fruity, which is like a slur, or not slur. It's being reclaimed, I think, a little bit, but like it's not comfortable when cis scientists, cis hetero guys are like calling things fruity. So they thought fruitless was a little nicer. I don't know. But this idea was that the fruitless gene is actually the thing that triggers the sex-specific behavior. So if a male has a deletion of this gene or a loss of function of this gene, they will no longer do a mating dance to attract a female. They'll smell like a male, they'll look like a male, but they are not advertising it. So that's cool. They also can do a gain of function of this gene in females. So the female looks like a female, smells like a female, but she will try to attract other females. Now, the million-dollar question is, if fruit flies, I don't know if this is true or not, if they are sentient in that they can have a sense, I think, therefore I am, or at least recognize themselves in a certain way, do they get frustrated when they have this activated gene, but they don't have the means to actually get that reciprocation from females? These fruitless gain-of-function females, do they feel frustration? Do they feel like they're not really male fruit flies? I'm asking if they have gender dysphoria, because this is an interesting question, and we will never know in a certain sense. We can't do the mirror test on them, let alone a gender mirror test. We've never got that before. But what I want to think about is with these fruit flies, we know that the development of these behaviors and the sex-specific kind of signaling that could very well cause some degree of potential frustration for them. And this means that maybe every single animal could potentially have a gender deviant population. Deviant. I mean that in the nicest way possible, because, you know, there's always differences from the norm, and the differences from the norm is what makes life beautiful, right? One thing about that paper, if you do read it, there is a slur in it, which is very gross. I think it comes from pornography, so yikes. Be careful if you're reading that paper. It is in the description, but all this to say is humans have very weird ideas about sex, gender, that kind of thing. And I think I want to close with the idea that, life is beautiful, mysterious, and there's lots of diversity, and we don't know everything about it, and there's some things which may be inherently unknowable. But we should be nice and try to understand that diversity rather than try to impose our values upon it, and be open to the possibility that maybe things are a little bit more complicated than we originally thought. Go in with an attitude of curiosity, and if someone accidentally misgenders your dog, please be nice about it, because I'm sure your dog doesn't care too much, and people are trying to be nice. I think there is some ways that we could all do a little bit better that way, and try to all be nice to each other that way, and live in a world where we can all try to work together to make it a better and more accommodating place for people of all different sexes and genders. And that's what I wanted to say for this Pride Month, and I hope I didn't alienate too many people with this one. But I do want to also extend this as an opportunity to learn. So I do have the sources in the description below. And hopefully you got something out of this, or at least you came away with something that you could find useful. Happy Pride Month, everyone. And I hope you have a good one. Peace.